I'm coming to the end now of my PhD at Cardiff University. It's been a bit of a long one now. It's been about 2 years before even starting, just trying to plan this entire project, and eventually I managed to get funding for it. And 4 years later, here I am, going to hopefully show you guys some. Half of it's going to be travel photos, and then half of it's going to be complicated genetics and transcriptomics. So, as I quickly mentioned, this was a project that was conceived about 6 years ago, and the idea was I wanted to spend a bit of time going out exploring the world and being a proper scientist, scientists of old, going into the forests and hunting for things. So I thought, why not go climb a volcano and look at earthworms? Earthworms, I wasn't entirely sure about at the beginning, but what I wanted to do was, what is so hard about living at altitude? Okay, well, you've got maybe a few thousand meters of elevation change, and during that you're going to get a reduction in the oxygen that you can breathe. You're going to have colder temperatures. You're going to have thunderstorms more coming in, and longer winters generally, particularly in temperate latitudes. Maybe not Central Africa, but up here in sort of European areas, going up the mountain tends to mean colder, longer winters. And again, as I said, why worms? Because this is definitely not something I thought I'd be doing when I was doing my undergraduate research. The simple thing is, they are big enough to look at and go, oh, I know what worm that is. But they are small enough that they don't move too far. You don't really want to try and study altitude if a species is going from the bottom of a mountain to the top of the mountain every day on its daily commute. Kind of negates what we're going to look for, which is how do animals adapt to high altitude. So, part of the idea was, where can we go to look for these worms that have a high altitude place and a low altitude place over a very short distance? And we chose Pico in the Azores. Now, Pico is hiding somewhere in this map, and yes, it's right in the middle of the Atlantic on a tiny little set of islands, Pico. And this is what Pico looks like. It is your classic pyramid-shaped volcano, as you would draw as a kid. Fantastic. Why is this fantastic? It means that you can have a worm at the bottom of the mountain and only travel a very short distance to get to the worm at the top of the mountain. Pico is quite a lush green island, full of diverse species, lots of life teeming on the island. But also, as you go up the volcano, as you can imagine, things get a bit more challenging, a bit more rocky, a bit more volcanic soils, bare exposed stuff. And you can even see in this left-hand picture the frost, that even though it's the middle of summer, there's still frost at the top. And you go a bit higher, you climb a bit higher. This is several hours into the climb now, and quite a lot of complaining later. I finally managed to get my supervisor right to the top, and you're above the clouds. And this here is the crater of the volcano, right at the very top. This is the actual crater. And interestingly, we find worms living in this crater. Now, this volcano exploded only about 300 years ago, so the fact that we're finding worms here is pretty remarkable. And yes, the weather can be pretty awful too. On this trip, my phone died, my camera died. It wasn't the best trip, but we did get worms. What you're seeing here is basically a family tree of what the worms we found on this island were. We've got a few at the very bottom. We've got a few species described in red with horrible long scientific names, but we only really found a few of those. We found a few more of the species in green, Lumbricus terrestris, but the most amount of worms was this species called Aproctoda caliginosa. And the fact that these things are quite wide gives you an idea of just how many there were. but the fact that they're not very deep says that actually they're very closely related. This is great for us, which means that we can compare the bottom with the top without, saying, well, they're different species almost, they're so diverse. They're actually very closely related, so we can do good comparisons with that. First thing we needed to do was to develop a genome for these species. Nobody knows what this was before, but we needed to know it because it acts as a tool. We can look at in effect, looking what the genome is a map to understanding what the changes we're going to look for. So DNA has 4 base pairs. It has A, T, C, and G. And it has this particular species has about 650 million base pairs that come from the mum and about 650 million base pairs that come from the dad. And that's split over 18 fragments, basically chromosomes. And what I wanted to do was try and work out how this very complicated jigsaw gets put back together. Unfortunately, it's not so straightforward as every single piece going back together, because there are very obscure pieces that could go in many places, pieces that you just can't work out what's meant to happen. So you can never get really a perfect reassembly of this jigsaw. The best you can do is try and get as bigger fragments within this jigsaw as you can. So, well, the best thing that anyone has managed for an earthworm before has about 3,000 of those base pairs in one piece. Well, we managed to get 1.2 million of them together. So this was quite a big increase in the size of this jigsaw, and it gave us a much better idea of what the picture was for that genome. So that now allows us to ask the question, are the worms at the top of a mountain, so for this volcano, adapted or acclimatized to high altitude? What do I mean by that? Well, acclimatized means what the genes are doing. We all have a genome. Each of those genes do a very specific thing, and we want to know whether they're being turned on or turned off. Adaptation is where you actually have mutations to those genes, and we want to know whether those mutations have given an advantage to that earthworm. So first thing we wanted to do was create a little experiment, take some worms to the top of the mountain, worms to the bottom of the mountain, and put them in different conditions. So what we have here is we're showing that we put the worms at a room temperature and worms at something that is very close to freezing, so conditions that you might find at the top of this volcano. And also we've got different sort of oxygen compositions. We want to see how atmosphere pressure changes, so we're going to get fluctuations in oxygen availability, and then we're going to look at how those genes sort of either turn on or turn off. Now this complicated thing going on here, if we look at the left hand, this is basically a great big map saying what genes are turned on, what genes are turned off. And what we found from it was that the low altitude population turned on everything and turned off a load of things, and it was in a massive stress response. It didn't know what to do, so it was just going, I need to do something, and I'm going to turn everything on and hope something works. The low altitude population, so the high altitude population from the top of the mountain was a bit more, this is quite normal, I can relax with this is not a big deal. So this was the first thing that was really, okay, well, the high altitude population can survive at high altitude. This is, and challenging extreme weather conditions. The low altitude one is not really suited for that. So then we also looked, and we wanted to see whether there were mutations within these individuals. So we looked at the high altitude, and we found out there was a map on the right hand side of here. We have a load of genes that had mutations in, and we thought, okay, well this is interesting, because all of these genes that have mutations come into these few genes in the center that are circled in red. And these few genes were, interestingly, very highly regulated in the low altitude population, and they basically didn't exist in the high altitude population. These genes are responsible for environmental regulation. So we've basically found that not only are the high altitude worms acclimatized to live at high altitude, as you might expect, but they are also adapted. And they've gone through all of these mutations in a very rapid period of time. What does that mean, basically? Well, it means that they can survive extreme weather much better. Particularly now that we're going into an era of increased extreme weather events, increased by human accelerated global warming, these worms are able to survive that a bit better. That means that worms at the bottom of a mountain that might be more exposed to extreme conditions, they might all die, but the populations that live at the top will survive. And it means that we can potentially take these populations from the top and use them for reseeding where extinctions have happened in lower altitudes. And the more sort of blue sky kind of thing that we can do with this is take them to Mars. Why do I say that? Well, a lot of people might think, we can do this all growing plants in sort of water, do aquaponics, but they kind of forget that, well, we need to have something to deal with the biological waste. We don't eat all of the plants, and humans produce waste, and we need worms that can turn this into something that is safe and can be used to fertilize new plants. That's basically what I've been doing for the last 4 years. And yeah, any questions, I guess?
Amazing. Thanks so much, Iain. That was truly incredible. I think seeing the journey from the low altitude to the high, and then hopefully maybe one day to Mars is quite inspirational. If a worm can do it, so can we. So as before, if anyone has any questions on Facebook, just type them in a comment on the video. There is a small delay, but we can see them when they come up. So please do that. We'll mention them in the Zoom chat, and the same in here. Just to get things going, I'll start with a question. So Iain, obviously you've looked at earthworms as an incredible study system for this, but do you think that a similar response might be seen in other animals as well?
So we'd certainly expect to see a similar thing within other species of earthworms. Beyond that, it's not really well known, actually. One of the interesting things about earthworms is that they're skin breathers. So they don't have lungs, you breathe through their skin, and humans and mammals and a lot of species have something called hemoglobin, which is an oxygen-carrying molecule. Earthworms have something called erythropoietin, which is many, many times bigger, and that's used for carrying oxygen. Earthworms are also quite ancient. They're about 180 million years old, and this particular species is 45 million years old. So these are very long acquired sort of abilities. Mammals don't necessarily need the same kind of responses, partly because they're bigger, they can move around a lot more, they can find shelters, but that's not to mean that other species don't have it. It's just that we haven't bothered to look at it. Mammals particularly are very heavily researched in comparison to species like earthworms. Nobody has really cared to look, and I think if we do start looking, we might just find other species can.
Amazing. Yeah, it's incredible to think what a worm can do and what that could possibly mean for the wider animal kingdom. Does anyone else have any questions in the Zoom chat? I can definitely ask another one. I've got so many. So obviously you've looked at these worms in the high altitude. If you were to take them to Mars, obviously over millions of years, you'd expect to see some kind of evolutionary change. But do you think you could see an adaptation like this in such a rapid time to take them even further into a state of resilience?
So I've explained two conditions at which earthworms can survive. That is low oxygen and low temperatures. Two other things that you have with a Martian atmosphere are high levels of carbon dioxide. Well, actually, just on the neighbouring islands, we found earthworms that were living in 90% carbon dioxide, which is toxic to almost anything I can think about. But the earthworms have survived. So we've got species there that are adapted to that condition. So And then you think, well, what's the other condition? Well, there's high radiation levels. Well, interestingly, earthworms live in soil, so they're kind of protected. So they almost don't need much adaptation to survive in Martian soils. They're almost semi-primed and ready to go. Earthworms also have a very high diversity within their genome. So these diversity in their genome means that they're very plastic to changes, and they can sort of we seem to find the more we look, the more we challenge them, the more we can find that actually they can survive almost anything that we throw at them. So yeah, it's hard to say for sure, but it's almost like they don't need too much to adapt to.
Yeah, amazing. They're almost ready-made for it. That's good to know. It's incredible what earthworms can do, and truly makes you realize why Darwin loved them. So unless we have any more questions, we do have something in the chat. From Bhavna Gupta. Do you think that there might be types of earthworms that are also adapted to high temperatures?
Well, we know that we can find earthworms living in Brazilian soils. Interesting, actually, some of the worms that you even find in the Brazilian soils are enormous. I mean, we're talking meter-long behemoths of worms, and you know, the temperatures that we get in Brazil can be quite challenging for humans to live in. The general sort of limitation for an earthworm will be moisture. It can be hot, but it needs to have some moisture to the soil. So yeah, that's going to be the trade-off that an earthworm has to face. It certainly will be, at most temperatures that we find on Earth will be fine for an earthworm to survive as long as there's moisture.
Amazing. Oh, and another question from Borjo. Do earthworms have pathogens?
Yes, earthworms have pathogens. They actually have quite a few sort of things that are you could consider to be living in sort of harmony with. So there's a bacteria that often lives within earthworms called Verminifobacter. That's found in a whole heap of worms and quite common, doesn't seem to do much with it. They've got a blood supply, they can get pathogens, but again, this is something that's not hugely researched.
And he's had a follow-up question of, does the temp resilience improve in higher altitude earthworms?
So we've only managed to take worms from about 100 meters and about 2,200 meters from this one location. One thing that we'd really love to do is go to Africa, go to somewhere like Mount Kenya, which is right on the equator. And the reason that we do that is because we can then get to a higher altitude. The grass line the maximum height in Pico is about 2,300 meters. The maximum height we can get to before it is permanently frozen is about 4,000 meters on Mount Kenya. So what we'd like to do is we'd like to go there, look at earthworms and see whether the populations from there are even more resilient